The world's first billionaire probably didn't look quite like you'd expect. By the time the public truly got a look at him, John D. Rockefeller was a spindly, hairless man who looked as though a stiff breeze might well blow him over. He spent his Sunday mornings at church and his afternoons handing out shiny new dimes to children, offering soft-spoken lectures on the virtues of thrift. To the casual observer, in 1920, he was a kindly, eccentric grandfather, the great benefactor who had funded the eradication of hookworm and the creation of modern medical research. But if you had asked the American public a generation earlier, they would have described a very different man. They saw an apex predator who had systematically strangled an entire industry. To his rivals, he was the terrible king of the robber barons, a man who used secret railroad deals and cutthroat intimidation to seize control of 90% of the nation's oil. He built a trust, essentially a shadow empire so vast and so shielded from the law that it eventually took the Supreme Court of the United States to tear it apart. John D. Rockefeller remains the most polarizing figure in the history of capitalism. He was a devout Baptist who believed his wealth was a gift from God, and a ruthless monopolist who absolutely crushed the men who stood in his way. So today, let's take a journey to the Gilded Age to look past those shiny dimes and the philanthropy. We're going to look at how a bookkeeper from Cleveland became the most hated man in America, and whether the $500 million he gave away was an act of true grace or the ultimate price for a clean conscience. In 1904, a cartoon titled Next appeared in the pages of Puck magazine, and it quickly became the defining image of the era. It depicted a colossal octopus, its body a massive bloated oil tank labeled Standard Oil. Its tentacles were everywhere, wrapped around the steel and copper industries, coiled tightly around the US Capitol, and one lone muscular arm reaching towards the White House itself. You might have seen it before, and if you haven't, well, now you have. At the center of this web was John D. Rockefeller. By the early 1900s, he wasn't just a businessman, he was a phenomenon. He was the world's first billionaire, possessing a fortune that represented nearly 3% of the entire American economy. In modern terms, we're talking about a level of relative economic weight that would make Elon Musk look like a small business owner. But as his bank account grew, his reputation shrank. To much of the public, he was simply the most hated man in America. He was the terrible king who had turned the American dream into a private fiefdom. But fast forward 30 years and that shifts quite a bit. The monster has been replaced by a frail, elderly man strolling across a golf course in Florida or exiting a Baptist church. He gave away tens of thousands of those dimes we mentioned at the start. Oh, and he also gave away over $500 million to build universities, fund medical breakthroughs, and transform global health. This creates the central tension that historians have been debating for over a century. Was the dime-giving, church-going grandfather a carefully crafted PR mask designed to hide the scars of a ruthless career? Or was the octopus simply a byproduct of a man who believed that efficiency was a moral virtue and that competition was a wasteful sin? So, big question. Can a lifetime of unprecedented giving truly wash out the methods used to acquire the gold in the first place? To find the answer, we have to go back to before the billions and before the tentacles, to a childhood defined by a man known as Devil Bill. Devil Bill's son. To understand the absolute iron-willed discipline of John D. Rockefeller, you have to understand the two warring spirits that raised him. He was born in 1939 in a small farmhouse in Richford, New York, but his childhood was anything but stable. On one side there was his mother, Eliza Davison. She was a woman of granite-like Baptist faith who lived by the maxims of thrift and duty. With a brood of 6 children to feed and a husband who was, well, rarely home, Eliza raised John on a steady diet of willful waste makes woeful want. Sounds like something my grandparents would say. Anyway, she taught him that every penny was a soldier to be commanded and that tithing to the church was not optional, it was a debt to the Lord Almighty above. On the other side was his father, William Avery Rockefeller, a man known to the neighbors as Big Bill, but to history as Devil Bill. Bill Rockefeller was a traveling botanic physician, which was a polite Gilded Age term for a snake oil salesperson. He would disappear for months at a time, traversing the back roads of New York and Ohio, selling cancer cures and bottled wonder tonics that were mostly alcohol and laxatives. When he did return, he arrived in flashy clothes with rolls of cash, playing the part of the wealthy benefactor before vanishing again. But Bill wasn't just a con artist on the road, he was a con artist at home too. He once famously bragged, "I cheat my boys every chance I get. I want to make them sharp." He would loan his sons money and then demand it back with interest when they least expected it, viewing fatherhood as a series of lessons in survival and cynicism. The instability went deeper than finances. For years, Bill lived a double life as a bigamist. While Eliza struggled in Cleveland, Bill had a second wife and a second family in Canada under the alias Dr. William Livingston. Biographers like Ron Chernow suggest the environment forged the specific steel of Rockefeller's character. By the time the family settled in Cleveland in the 1850s, young John had become the family's emotional and financial anchor. He took on the burden of his father's absence, meticulously tracking every odd job and every cent earned in a small paper pocketbook. To many historians, the terrible king's later obsession with total market control wasn't really about greed, it was a psychological reaction to a childhood without trust. Ledger A and the Gospel of Efficiency. In September 1855, a 16-year-old John D. Rockefeller spent 6 weeks walking the streets of Cleveland in a suit and tie looking for work. But he was rejected by almost every firm in the city until he walked into the offices of Hewitt & Tuttle, a firm of commission merchants. They hired him as an assistant bookkeeper, and for Rockefeller, he knew he had found his calling. It was here that he began Ledger A. This small, leather-bound book became the most famous artifact of his early life. In it, he recorded every single penny that touched his hands with the devotion of a monk. He tracked his expenditure down to the cent, a nickel for a bowl of soup, a few pennies for a shirt collar. But Ledger A revealed something more than just frugality. It revealed a man who viewed wealth as a sort of spiritual trust. Even when he was earning a mere $16 a month, Rockefeller was tithing. In 1857, his records show he gave away $28.37 to his church and various charities. By 1859, that number was climbing to $72.22. He was giving away roughly 10% of his income before he was even 20 years old. This was Rockefeller's gospel of efficiency. He mastered the arts of double-entry bookkeeping, a system where every transaction has an equal and opposite entry, ensuring the books are always balanced. In a chaotic mid-19th century market where most businesses guessed at their profits, Rockefeller used these ledgers to hunt down any waste. In 1859, he took these skills and formed a produce partnership called Clark and Rockefeller. While other merchants were distracted by the excitement of the trade, John was in the back room scrutinizing shipping costs and storage fees. He believed that God had given him a gift for making money, and to waste even a fraction of a cent was, in his mind, a sin against that gift. The relentless focus on the bottom line was the engine that would soon drive his entry into the oil business. He wanted a system he could optimize, control, and eventually absolutely dominate. Oil fever and the Cleveland edge. In August 1859, a man named Edward Drake struck oil near Titusville, Pennsylvania, and the world went mad. It was the American gold rush, but in liquid form. Thousands of wildcatters flooded into the hills, punching holes in the earth with a desperate, chaotic energy. But oil in its raw state is pretty useless. To be profitable, it has to be turned into kerosene, the new light that was replacing expensive whale oil in lamps across the globe. But the early oil industry was a nightmare of instability. Wells would gush and then run dry. Prices would swing from $20 a barrel to 10 cents in a matter of months. Refineries were often little more than these little ramshackle wooden sheds that frequently caught fire or produced bad kerosene that exploded in people's living rooms. Which isn't great for business. Rockefeller watched all of this going down from Cleveland and he was repulsed by it. To a man who worshipped the orderly rows of Ledger A, the Pennsylvania oil fields looked ridiculously wasteful. He realized that the real money and power didn't lie in the drilling sites themselves, but in the refining and the transportation. In 1863, he partnered with a talented chemist named Samuel Andrews. While Andrews perfected a process to wring more kerosene out of every barrel, Rockefeller focused on the geography. You see, Cleveland was hundreds of miles from the oil wells, but it was the perfect strategic choke point. It had access to the Great Lakes for shipping, and more importantly, it was served by multiple competing railroad lines. Rockefeller knew that if he could play the railroads against each other, he could secure lower shipping rates than any of his rivals. So, in 1870, he and his partners, including the brilliant dealmaker Henry Flagler, incorporated the Standard Oil Company of Ohio. At the time, they controlled only about 4% of the world's oil refining. A decent enough slice, but Rockefeller had no intention of sharing the pie. Standard Oil was built on the idea that the standard should be absolute. Their kerosene was safer, their barrels were tighter, and their costs were lower. But as Rockefeller looked out at the dozens of other refineries in Cleveland, he saw them not as competitors, but as inefficiencies that needed to be corrected. The chaos of the early oil boom had created 1,000 small winners. John D. Rockefeller was about to make sure there was only one. Him. Secret rebates and the Cleveland massacre. To understand why the name Rockefeller had a bit of a bad rep, let's consider the year 1872. So this was the year that Rockefeller moved from being a successful businessman to an apex predator. It started with a secret alliance called the South Improvement Company. The scheme was very clever, and to his competitors, well, rather demonic. Rockefeller and a few powerful allies made a backroom deal with the major railroads. In exchange for shipping huge, predictable volumes of oil, Standard Oil would receive rebates, massive discounts on freight costs. But the deal went a step further into what were called drawbacks. For every barrel of oil a competitor shipped, the railroad would pay a percentage of that rival's fee directly to Rockefeller. Like we said, very, very clever. Rockefeller was essentially taxing his rivals for the privilege of trying to compete with him. When the secret leaked, the oil region, rather predictably, erupted. Angry producers burned Rockefeller in effigy and launched a massive boycott that eventually forced the Pennsylvania legislature to revoke the company's charter. But for Rockefeller, the South Improvement Company was merely a smokescreen. While his rivals were busy celebrating their victory over the railroads in Pennsylvania, Rockefeller was back in Cleveland, quietly executing what would be known as the Cleveland Massacre. Armed with the massive capital he had saved and the terrifying leverage of his railroad deals, he began visiting his 26 local competitors. His pitch was rarely a shouting match. It was a cold, mathematical demonstration. He would show the owners his books, prove that Standard Oil's costs were lower, and then offer to buy them out. Often for cents on the dollar, paid in Standard Oil stock. The message was clear: join the Standard or be absolutely crushed. This was the apex predator in action. If a refiner refused, Rockefeller would simply drop his price so low that the competitor would bleed out. He would whisper to bankers to cut off their credit. In less than 3 months, Rockefeller had swallowed 22 of the 26 refineries in Cleveland. Years later, a widow of one of these ruined refiners would claim Rockefeller had robbed her family. Rockefeller, meanwhile, maintained to his dying day that he was a savior. In his mind, these small, inefficient refineries were doomed anyway. By forcing them into his fold, he believed he was bringing order to the chaotic world. But to the people of Cleveland and the oil fields, this was an ambush. Standard Oil had rigged the game. The trust. By the end of the 1870s, Rockefeller had a stranglehold on the market. Standard Oil controlled over 90% of the oil refining capacity in the United States. But there was a small legal problem. At the time, a company incorporated in one state, like Ohio, couldn't easily own stock in a company in another state, like Pennsylvania or New York. To solve this, Rockefeller's legal team invented the trust. In 1882, the shareholders of some 40 separate companies handed over their stock to a board of 9 trustees, with Rockefeller at the head. In exchange, the shareholders received trust certificates. On paper, the 40 companies remained separate. In reality, they moved as a single massive organism directed by a single brain. This trust was valued at roughly $70 million. A ridiculous sum that allowed Rockefeller to coordinate every move across the entire bloody continent. Rockefeller understood a fundamental rule of power. You don't need to own every barrel of oil in the world. You just need to own the choke points. He invested heavily in vertical integration. Standard Oil built its own barrels, its own warehouses, and its own fleet of tank cars. Most importantly, they built a pipeline. If a driller in Pennsylvania wanted to get their oil to a refinery, they often had to use a Standard Oil pipe. If a store in Iowa wanted to sell kerosene, they had to buy it from a Standard Oil wagon. Independent producers became price takers. Standard would offer a take it or leave it price for crude oil. If the producers complained, Standard would simply stop the flow in the pipelines or deny them space on the rail cars. Simple. This is where the robber baron debate gets complicated. While Rockefeller was ruthlessly crushing his peers, the experience for the average American consumer was actually improving. Under Standard's reign, the price of kerosene plummeted by nearly 80%. To Rockefeller, the lower prices were proof of his wonderful benevolence. To his critics, the lower prices were very predatory, a way to starve out any small business that dared to compete until there was no one left to challenge the king. The legal walls were already beginning to close in. However, in 1892, the Ohio Supreme Court ordered the trust to dissolve, calling it a menace to the public. But Rockefeller was already 3 steps ahead, moving the entire operation to New Jersey, a state with much friendlier laws for holding companies. The Octopus wasn't dead yet. Ida Tarbell lights the fuse. For decades, Rockefeller had operated in a world of shadows, private ledgers, and whispered agreements. But in 1902, the shadows were suddenly flooded with light. The source wasn't a rival tycoon or even a government prosecutor. No, it was a soft-spoken, iron-willed journalist named Ida Tarbell. For Tarbell, the story of Standard Oil was personal. She had grown up in the Pennsylvania oil regions, the daughter of an independent oil man who had watched his livelihood wither under the pressure of the Self-Improvement Company's secret deals. She had seen the massacre firsthand from the perspective of the casualties. Writing for McClure's magazine, Tarbell began a 19-part series titled The History of the Standard Oil Company. It was a masterpiece of what would become known as muckraking journalism. Tarbell didn't rely on rumors. She spent years digging through court records, congressional reports, and corporate filings. She meticulously documented how Standard Oil used fake independent companies to spy on rivals, how they bullied small store owners into boycotting competitors, and the exact mechanics of those illicit railroad rebates. Tarbell made a crucial distinction. She didn't hate Rockefeller because he was big. She hated him because she believed he had achieved that size through fraud and force. The public was enthralled and horrified. Tarbell portrayed Rockefeller as a cold, calculating machine, famously describing him as the most remarkable figure in our business life, but also as a man with a terrible persistence that lacked any trace of human mercy. Rockefeller was stung. He refused to acknowledge her publicly, referring to her in private only as Miss Tarbell. Quite Trump-coded, really. But the damage was done. Tarbell had given the American public a common language to describe their unease. By the time the series was published as a book in 1904, it had become the handbook of the progressive era. It gave President Theodore Roosevelt the political ammunition that he needed to take on the monopolies. The terrible king was no longer just a figure in a ledger, he was now a target in the crosshairs of the American legal system. Sherman, the rule of reason and the breakup. By 1890, the American public's fear of the octopus had reached a fever pitch. In response, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. It was a short, deceptively simple piece of legislation that outlawed every combination in the form of trust or otherwise in restraint of trade. But for 15 years, the law sat on the shelf, a dull blade against a titan made of steel and oil. Well, that changed in 1906, when the Justice Department finally filed suit against Standard Oil of New Jersey. The government's argument was essentially what Ida Tarbell had written, that Standard hadn't won the market through better service, but through a systematic restraint of trade that made competition impossible. The case wound its way through the courts for 5 years, landing at the Supreme Court in 1911. In a landmark discussion, the court ruled against Rockefeller, but they added a catch that still shapes American business today: the rule of reason. You see, the court argued that the Sherman Act didn't ban all big companies. It only banned those that exerted an unreasonable restraint on trade. Standard Oil, with its secret rebates and predatory pricing, was the textbook definition of unreasonable. The court ordered the unthinkable. The octopus was to be cut up. Within 6 months, Standard Oil was chopped into 34 independent companies. On paper, this was a crushing defeat for the terrible king. But in reality, it was the greatest financial windfall in human history. Rockefeller still owned roughly 25% of the stock in the original trust. When the breakup happened, he received proportional shares in every single one of those 34 baby standards. Over the next decade, as the world transitioned from kerosene lamps to internal combustion engines, the demand for gasoline absolutely exploded. These new companies, with names still recognized today like Exxon, Mobil, Chevron and Amoco, saw their stock values soar. By 1913, Rockefeller's personal fortune had nearly doubled to $900 million. By 1916, he became the world's first confirmed billionaire. The government had successfully killed the octopus, but they had unleashed a fleet of smaller, much more nimble monsters. Rockefeller had lost his title as the active head of an empire, but in the process, he became something even more powerful: a ghost shareholder with more liquid wealth than most countries. But as the money piled up into mountains, the human cost of the climb was beginning to catch up with him. Towns, producers and workers. While the lawyers argued over rule of reason and restraint of trade, the people in the oil regions were living through a structural earthquake. For independent producers like Ida Tarbell's father, Frank, the rise of the octopus was a slow-motion catastrophe. Frank Tarbell had built a successful business making wooden oil tanks, but when Rockefeller secured his secret railroad rebates, the independent producers who bought Frank's tanks were suddenly unable to ship their product at a profit. Frank watched his partner commit suicide and his neighbors' businesses evaporate. In towns across Pennsylvania and Ohio, the local economy lived or died by the Standard. If Rockefeller bought your local refinery, the town had a future. If he decided to bypass it, build his own pipeline elsewhere, it became a ghost town. Inside the refineries, the gospel of efficiency had a very different flavor. To Rockefeller, a worker was simply an entry in Ledger A, simply a cost to be minimized. Standard Oil offered steady work and, in some cases, slightly higher pay than the chaotic wildcat operations, but it came at the cost of the Gilded Age norm: 10 to 12-hour shifts in a landscape of toxic fumes and heavy machinery. If a worker was injured, there was no safety net. If they tried to organize, they were met with the full weight of a company that viewed unions as inefficient interference with the natural order of business. There is some historical irony here. To the urban consumer in New York or Chicago, Rockefeller provided a safe, high-quality product that didn't explode in their children's bedrooms. But that safety was built on the ruins of the independent producers. This created a strange, fractured America. On one hand, you had the captain of industry who had tamed the wild frontier and brought light to the masses. On the other, you had the robber baron who had destroyed the middle class of the oil regions to do it. Who actually bore the cost of that 80% drop in kerosene prices? Well, it was the small businessmen who lost their shops, the driller who was forced to sell his oil for pennies, and the laborer who worked in a standardized world where his only value was his output. As Rockefeller retreated from the daily management of his machine in the 1890s, he left behind a world that was richer, safer, and vastly more unequal. But as he stepped away from the ledger, he found that while he could control the price of oil, he couldn't control the toll the stress was taking on his own body. Alopecia, dimes, and the birth of big philanthropy. By the early 1890s, the terrible king was winning every battle, but he was losing his health. Rockefeller began to suffer from a series of stress-related ailments, severe digestive issues, bouts of depression, and a total collapse of his immune system that manifested as alopecia. Within a few short years, the man who once had a full head of hair and a thick moustache was left completely smooth. He lost his eyebrows, his eyelashes, and every hair on his head. He began wearing a rotating set of silver grey wigs, but the transformation was jarring. His doctor gave him a blunt ultimatum: slow down or die. Rockefeller listened. By 1896, at the age of 57, he effectively retired from the day-to-day management of Standard Oil, handing the reins to subordinates like John D. Archibald. But he didn't just retreat into the shadows. He pivoted into something else entirely. He decided to apply the Standard Oil method to the one thing he had done since he was 16 years old: giving money away. But the world was changing, and the thousands of letters he received every day begging for money were another inefficiency that he couldn't stand. He needed a system. Enter Frederick T. Gates, a former Baptist minister with a mind as sharp and cold as Rockefeller's own. Gates told Rockefeller plainly, "Your fortune is rolling up like an avalanche. You must keep up with it. You must distribute it faster than it grows. If you do not, it will crush you and your children and your children's children." Yikes. Together, they pioneered scientific philanthropy. No longer would Rockefeller hand out small checks to random churches. They would fund whole institutions. They would build universities and research labs. Rockefeller famously remarked, "God gave me my money," a statement that infuriated his critics who saw it as supreme arrogance. But in his own mind, it was a statement of terrifying responsibility. This was the era of the dimes. Rockefeller began carrying a pocketful of shiny new coins everywhere he went. He handed them to neighbors, caddies, and children, often accompanying the gift with a mini sermon on saving. To his critics, it was a cheap PR stunt to soften his image after the Tarbell exposé. But to those who knew him, it was a genuine, almost obsessive delight in the smallest units of his empire, the philanthropic empire. Rockefeller essentially engineered a new kind of power. If Standard Oil was the octopus of the industry, his philanthropic empire became a parallel state, a massive private bureaucracy dedicated to the well-being of mankind. It began in earnest with the University of Chicago. In 1889, Rockefeller made a $600,000 pledge to start a small Baptist college, but he treated the donation like a business deal. He demanded matching funds from the city, ensuring he wasn't the only one with skin in the game. Over the next few decades, that small college became a world-class research institution fueled by $35 million of Rockefeller's wealth. But his most visceral project was the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, founded in 1901. At the time, American medicine was a patchwork of superstitions and local traditions. Rockefeller, spurred by the death of his grandson from scarlet fever and the urging of Frederick Gates, wanted a scientific approach. This was America's first dedicated biomedical institute. Within years, its researchers were decoding infectious diseases, fundamentally changing how humans survive. The sheer scale of the intervention was most visible in the American South. In the early 1900s, the South was physically and economically drained by hookworm, a parasite that lived in the soil and entered through bare feet, leaving millions lethargic and anemic. In 1909, the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission was launched with a $1 million grant. Their survey found infection rates as high as 40% in some areas. Within 5 years, they had mapped the disease across 11 states and treated nearly 700,000 people, virtually eradicating the germ of laziness. However, this scientific benevolence had its shadows. Through the General Education Board, Rockefeller funneled billions in today's dollars into schools and medical colleges. But in the Jim Crow South, this aid often reinforced segregation. The funding was paternalistic, dictated by white northern elites who decided what uplift looked like for black communities, often prioritizing vocational training over higher academic aspirations. By the time the Rockefeller Foundation was chartered in 1913, Rockefeller's total lifetime giving reached approximately $540 million. That's about the equivalent of 15 to 20 billion in 2026. He had created a model where a single private individual could dictate the public health and education priorities of an entire nation. It was an incredible achievement, but it raised a question. Is it a healthy democracy when the well-being of mankind is decided by the man who owns the oil? And while Rockefeller was funding laboratories to save lives, his own family's business interests were about to be caught in a conflict where lives were being taken. When Rockefeller capital meets labor. To understand the full, dark height of the Rockefeller shadow, we have to look at the coal dust of southern Colorado. By 1914, the Rockefeller family had moved their capital into various industries, including a controlling stake in the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, or CF&I. The conditions in the CF&I mines were a throwback to a more brutal age. Miners lived in company-owned towns, paid rent to the company, and bought their food from company stores using company scrip. When thousands of miners went on strike in 1913, demanding better pay and the right to join a union, CF&I responded by evicting them from their homes in the dead of winter. The miners moved their families into a massive tent colony in a place called Ludlow. On the morning of April 20th, 1914, the tension broke. The Colorado National Guard, largely financed by the company, took up positions on the hills overlooking the colony. What followed was a day-long battle that ended in a massacre. As the guardsmen moved into the camp, they set the tents on fire. In the aftermath, the horrifying cost of the conflict was revealed. Among the 21 confirmed dead were 2 women and 11 children who had been huddled in a death pit, a cellar dug beneath a tent to hide from the gunfire, only to be suffocated by the smoke of the fire above. The backlash was instant. This was the blood of children on the Rockefeller ledger. While John D. Rockefeller Sr. had largely delegated the management of CF&I to his son Jr., the elder Rockefeller remained the ultimate source of the capital. The public didn't really distinguish between the two. Protesters picketed their homes, and newspapers across the country branded the family as murderers. In the congressional hearings that followed, Frank Walsh, the chair of the Commission of Industrial Relations, grilled Rockefeller Jr. The testimony revealed a staggering disconnect. Jr. admitted he hadn't even read the coroner's report on the deaths, claiming he had relied entirely on the word of his managers on the ground. The terrible king was now an old man, and while he sat in his estate in Florida handing out dimes, his money was financing a private war in the West. Ludlow shattered the illusion that Rockefeller's wealth was a clean, clinical gift to be administered. It proved that the same fortune funding the eradication of hookworm in the South was also subsidizing the suppression of workers' rights in the West. The massacre forced the family into a radical pivot. It led to the hiring of the first modern public relations experts and a move towards labor reform. But for the miners in Colorado, the lesson was already written. The king's order was often enforced with guns. Okay, the Historians' War. When John D. Rockefeller died in 1937 at the age of 97, he left behind a battlefield for historians. Even in death, he remained a Rorschach test for the American dream. Depending on which book you pick up, he's either the villain who broke the back of American competition, or the genius who built the modern world. On one side of the trenches are the critics, who cement his legacy as the ultimate robber baron. To them, Rockefeller was a parasite on the Republic. They point to the secret rebates, the espionage against rivals, and the scorched earth buyouts of the Cleveland massacre as proof that his wealth was stolen, not earned. In this view, his philanthropy was nothing more than hush money paid to history, a desperate attempt to scrub the blood of Ludlow and the grease of his oil fields off his name. But in the 1940s, a new narrative began to take root, championed by historians like Alan Nevins. Nevins argued that Rockefeller was an industrial statesman. He suggested that the chaotic boom and bust oil industry of the 1860s needed a Rockefeller. By imposing order and efficiency, he didn't just make himself rich, he made energy cheap and reliable for a growing nation. Nevins' version of Rockefeller was a master architect who paved the way for the American century. Modern biographers, most notably Ron Chernow in his seminal work Titan, have tried to find the man between the myths. Chernow depicts a figure of staggering contradictions, a man who was genuinely deeply pious yet ruthlessly secretive, a man who could agonize over a donation to a local church while simultaneously plotting to bankrupt a neighbor. Chernow famously noted that Rockefeller was the biggest, baddest of the robber barons, yet also the most transformative philanthropist in history. Economists still argue over whether Standard Oil won because it was better at refining oil or because it was better at rigging the system. Was Rockefeller a predator who stifled innovation or a pioneer who invented the very concept of the modern corporation? The template Rockefeller created, first dominate the market, then save the world, is still the playbook for the titans of the 21st century. The more things change. From Standard Oil to big tech. Today we live in a world still lubricated by the fragments of Rockefeller's empire. When you pull up to a gas station, the names on the signs are the direct corporate descendants of that 1911 breakup. The seven sisters of oil that dominated the 20th century were in many ways just the original tentacles growing back as independent organisms. But the most enduring echo of the terrible king is found in our social fabric. The Rockefeller Foundation still operates with its 1913 charter, steering billions of dollars towards climate change initiatives and global health. The family itself remains influential, with an estimated collective net worth of around $10 billion spread across hundreds of descendants. Yet their greatest legacy is the template that John D. Rockefeller perfected, the art of the philanthropic pivot. Today, we see the same cycle repeating with a new generation of billionaires. Just as Rockefeller used the railroads to consolidate oil, modern tech giants use network effects and data to dominate digital choke points. And just like Rockefeller, these titans often follow a predictable path. Phase 1, aggressive, often predatory acquisition of the market. Phase 2, a pivot towards world-saving benevolence, funding schools, fighting diseases, and building legacy-defining foundations. It forces us to confront the same uncomfortable question that Ida Tarbell asked over a century ago. Does the good done at the end of a career justify the harm done at the beginning? When we allow individuals to amass wealth on a scale that rivals the GDP of entire nations, we essentially outsource our public priorities to them. We trade democratic oversight for private efficiency. Rockefeller proved that a single man's gospel of efficiency could eradicate a disease or build a university faster than any government. But he also proved that such power, when left in the shadows, can be used to crush anyone who stands in its way.